Now, the American Civil Rights Movement after World War II had, in the 1950s, moved forward drastically. And if you're one of my students listening to this, you will have hopefully already watched the very first episode of Eyes on the Prize. If you have never seen this, Eyes on the Prize is an amazing documentary series on the civil rights movement post World War II. And the very first episode does a great job of laying the foundation of the movement in the early 1950s. And the civil rights movement since World War I had focused specifically on breaking down racial discrimination in the legal system through legal challenges. We have an early success in 1948 with Shelley v. Kramer, which strikes down racially restrictive covenants in housing, but the very big ruling in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, which desegregates schools, will specifically overturn Plessy v. Ferguson, which was an 1896 Supreme Court, 1896, 1892, 1890s Supreme Court case, which had said that segregation was perfectly legal so long as the separated spaces were equal. So that separate but equal doctrine. But the Supreme Court overturns that, and the Brown versus Board ruling is very important because it lays the foundation for striking down other types of segregation. So, as the civil rights movement moves into the 1960s, we have momentum from the Brown versus Board of Education ruling, striking down segregation in education, the Montgomery bus boycott of the mid 1950s, which will elevate Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. to more national attention in Montgomery, Alabama, with the nearly year-long boycott on the bus system there over segregation. And as we move into 1960, we're going to see a shift in the movement with the participation of more college students and young people in their 20s. In Greensboro, North Carolina A&T students staged a 5-month-long protest at Woolworth's lunch counter. So Woolworth's was a department store that had segregated its restaurant space, and over 5 months, students from North Carolina A&T would go and sit at the lunch counter in the whites only section in a peaceful protest and occupation of this counter. So this is what we call the sit-in protest. You may recognize this tactic from unions in the Great Depression using this as a way to try to unionize automobile industries by occupying the plant and preventing the incursion of strike breakers. Similarly, sit-in protests in the civil rights movement physically occupy the space and highlight segregation in a visible way. By the end of 1960, 70,000 protesters had taken part in sit-ins nationwide to highlight the problem of segregated public spaces. In that same year, 1960, students in North Carolina founded the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, which was designed to organize college students to help them more effectively lead this grassroots local protests like sit-ins. And in particular, SNCC will play a vital role in the 1960s in encouraging mass participation among young people and elevating them to positions of leadership within a national civil rights movement. Another early 60s movement involving students was freedom rides. So CORE, or the Congress of Racial Equality, founded during World War II, decided that they were going to test compliance with a ban on segregation in interstate transport. So segregation in transportation had been a big issue, and the federal government had actually said that you could not enforce segregation on transportation in things like buses or trains that crossed state lines. So to see whether that was being complied with in the South, CORE sent pairs of students to specifically ride public transit across state lines to test whether they would actually listen. These protests continued despite the threat of violence against these freedom riders, and the Freedom Riders protests worked. They highlighted the fact that many Southern transportation companies were not in compliance with this ban on segregation, and this resulted in the Interstate Commerce Commission moving to ensure that their desegregation order in transportation had been assured. One of the most televised protests of the 1960s comes out of Birmingham. And the Birmingham protests highlight both the importance of young people as protesters in the civil rights movement and the power of television to bring attention, public attention, to the civil rights movement and to the issue of segregation. In Birmingham, Alabama, Martin Luther King Jr. is called in to help lead protests against segregation in the city of Birmingham. Birmingham had actually banned protests, and so Martin Luther King Jr. is actually arrested for protesting in Birmingham. And while he is sitting in his jail cell, he writes his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, which is his thoughts on the civil rights movement and the rights and responsibilities of people, including those white allies who wanted to help advance the movement. In May of 1963, the civil rights protesters agreed to allow children to join the protest. This was something that many civil rights organizers had been reluctant to do, to allow children who wanted to protest because of the threat of violence. When the children joined the protest, images of them being attacked by police dogs and fire hoses turned on them by Police Chief Bull Connor in Birmingham were caught on camera and televised. And so many Americans tuning into the daily news programs in May of 1963 were absolutely horrified to see these images of these children under attack protesting against segregation. And this ended up swaying popular support towards the civil rights activists by showing Americans outside the South the brutality and the violence associated with maintaining segregation. The demonstrations in Birmingham ended in the summer of 1963 with the town becoming desegregated, but that did not end the violence. In September 1963, a bomb set off at the 16th Street Baptist Church killed 4 girls, the youngest victim around 11 years old, but most of them teenagers. After the experience in Birmingham with the protests and the bombing, this is when Kennedy begins pushing for a national civil rights bill to break down Jim Crow system of segregation in the South. What also compels Kennedy to act on civil rights is the very public March on Washington. So, civil rights activists had first proposed the March on Washington during World War II to highlight segregation and discrimination in employment, particularly in hiring and promotion. The idea of staging a mass protest for civil rights on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. is revisited on August 28, 1963, when 250,000 people gather in a protest at the National Mall. This is where Martin Luther King Jr. gives his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. King is one of several speakers during this time. John Lewis, who's a congressional representative, was also invited to speak as one of the organizers within SNCC. He was told to edit and tone down his speech. No women were invited to speak, despite the fact that women played an important role in organizing the logistics of the March on Washington. And Bayard Rustin, who was a very important civil rights organizer and very crucial in the March on Washington organization, also had his contributions downplayed, in part because Rustin was an openly gay man. So the tensions behind the scene at the March of Washington protests are going to kind of foreshadow future splits in the movement, with women being frustrated with the sexism and becoming women's rights activists, with college students accusing those older activists of wanting to censor them and tell them what to do, and for the LGBTQ community to also similarly criticize homophobic strains within civil rights movements. So Kennedy's assassination in November of 1963 takes place before any movement on his proposed civil rights legislation. And Johnson, when he becomes president, starts to push Congress to adopt a Civil Rights Act to honor Kennedy's legacy as one of the last major things that Kennedy was pushing for. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination on the basis of race or sex in employment, public institutions, and public accommodations like restaurants and hotels, even if they were owned by private businesses. So this was dealing a death blow to the South system of Jim Crow segregation. As Johnson signed this bill into law, he famously stated, "I think we delivered the South to the Republican Party." And he was not wrong. Now, the one thing that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did not address was discrimination in voting. There was no strengthening of voting rights in that particular piece of legislation. And so activists in the summer of 1964 declared that this would be Freedom Summer. And activists went down to the South to launch voter registration drives to increase the number of registered African American voters. Violence greeted many campaign workers, and most notoriously, workers Michael Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney were murdered by a group of white people led by a deputy sheriff, still demonstrating that law enforcement was still looking the other way on a lot of this violence towards people working to end the system of segregation in the South.